December 8, 1944. The snow-covered hills of the Ardennes forest stretched endlessly before Lieutenant Thomas Crawford of the United States Army's 106th Infantry Division as his convoy of 23 trucks rumbled along the narrow Belgian road. The temperature had dropped to -15 degrees Celsius, and the men huddled in the back of the vehicles, their breath forming clouds in the freezing air. Crawford believed they were taking a safe route toward their winter positions, following intelligence reports that indicated minimal enemy presence in this quiet sector. His soldiers, mostly fresh replacements who had arrived in Europe just 3 weeks earlier, trusted the maps and the assurances of their commanders that this stretch of forest was secure. They had no idea they were driving straight into a carefully prepared trap that would have annihilated every single one of them. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What happened next would transform a teenage girl's simple act of courage into one of the most remarkable rescue operations of the entire European conflict, proving that sometimes the smallest voices can prevent the greatest tragedies. The morning had started routinely for 17-year-old Marie Dubois in the tiny village of Rochefort, Belgium. She lived with her grandmother in a stone farmhouse that had belonged to their family for 6 generations. Her parents had fled to England 2 years earlier, but Marie had refused to leave her grandmother, who was too frail to make the dangerous journey. Every day followed the same pattern. Wake before dawn, tend to the 3 chickens they somehow kept hidden from German patrols, fetch water from the well, and prepare what little food they had managed to save. But this morning was different. Marie had been gathering firewood in the forest when she heard voices speaking German. She froze behind a massive oak tree, her heart pounding so hard she feared they might hear it. Through the bare winter branches, she could see at least 40 soldiers from the German armed forces during the war, their white camouflage uniforms making them nearly invisible against the snow. They were positioning something along the hillside overlooking the main road, working with quiet efficiency that spoke of careful planning. Captain Wilhelm Schneider of the German military leadership at the time directed his men with hand signals, maintaining strict noise discipline. He had spent 3 days preparing this ambush site, studying the American convoy patterns, calculating the optimal killing zone. His unit had brought 6 heavy weapons and twice as many lighter arms, all positioned to create crossfire that would leave no escape route. The Americans had been using this road for supply runs for the past week, growing increasingly confident in its safety. Schneider knew that confidence would be their downfall. What he did not know was that a teenage girl was watching every move they made. Marie remained motionless for nearly 2 hours, watching the German soldiers complete their preparations. She counted 43 men, noted the positions of their equipment, observed how they carefully covered their tracks in the snow. When they finally settled into their concealed positions, she waited another 30 minutes to ensure they would not see her leave. Then, moving with painful slowness, she began backing away from the tree, each step placed with infinite care to avoid snapping branches or disturbing the snow in ways that might draw attention. The walk back to her village normally took 20 minutes. Marie made it in 15, running through the forest with a speed born of pure terror and desperate purpose. She burst into her grandmother's house gasping for breath and explained what she had seen. Her grandmother, who had lived through the first great conflict of the 20th century, understood immediately what this meant. American soldiers used that road. If they came through today, they would all perish. But how could one teenage girl and her elderly grandmother warn an entire army? The village of Rochefort had been occupied by German forces for 4 years. The local population had learned to survive through silence and invisibility, avoiding any action that might draw attention. Most families had lost someone to the occupation, either taken away for forced labor or executed for resistance activities. The penalty for helping Allied forces was immediate and severe. Everyone knew this. Everyone accepted it as the price of survival. Marie's grandmother looked at her granddaughter's frightened face and made a decision that would risk both their lives. She told Marie about the American patrol that sometimes passed through the village center, usually around midday. If they could reach those soldiers, if they could make them understand the danger, perhaps they could prevent a massacre. But they had to be careful. The Germans had informants everywhere, and even the act of speaking to American soldiers could result in execution. Lieutenant James Patterson of the United States Army's Military Intelligence Unit was conducting his routine patrol through Rochefort when he noticed the girl. She was standing near the village well, her posture stiff, her eyes fixed on his jeep, with an intensity that immediately caught his attention. Patterson had been working in occupied territories long enough to recognize the signs of someone who desperately needed to communicate but was too afraid to approach directly. He signaled his driver to slow down, then called out in his limited French asking if she knew where they might find fresh water. It was a simple pretext, a reason for them to stop and talk that would not seem suspicious to watching eyes. Marie approached the jeep, her hands trembling as she carried a bucket that provided cover for the conversation. In rapid, quiet French, she told Patterson what she had seen in the forest. Patterson's expression did not change, but his mind was racing. A convoy was scheduled to use that road in less than 3 hours. 480 men, 23 vehicles, heading straight into an ambush. He needed to verify this information, but he also needed to act immediately. He thanked Marie for the water, casually asking if she could show them the exact location on a map. She nodded, and Patterson instructed his driver to pull the jeep behind a building where they would not be visible from the main street. Marie spread Patterson's map on the hood of the jeep, her finger tracing the route she had taken that morning. She marked the ambush positions with surprising precision, describing the number of soldiers, the type of equipment they had positioned, even the white camouflage that made them nearly invisible. Patterson listened, making mental notes of every detail. Her information was too specific, too detailed to be fabricated. This girl had genuinely risked her life to bring this warning to them. What Patterson did not tell Marie was that he had received intelligence reports suggesting increased German activity in the Ardennes, but higher command had dismissed them as unlikely. The area had been quiet for weeks, and resources were stretched thin across multiple fronts. His warnings had been noted and filed away. Now, with this direct eyewitness account, he had the evidence he needed to force action. But first he had to get Marie to safety. He knew what would happen if the Germans discovered who had revealed their ambush. He offered to evacuate her and her grandmother immediately, but Marie refused. Leaving suddenly would draw attention, potentially exposing other villagers to reprisals. She had done what needed to be done. Now she would return home and pray that the Americans would believe her. Patterson watched her walk back toward her grandmother's house, this thin teenage girl in her worn winter coat, and felt a mixture of admiration and guilt. She had shown more courage in one morning than many soldiers showed in entire careers, and she was walking back into danger with nothing but hope as protection. He radioed his command post immediately. The response was skeptical. One girl's report against established intelligence assessments. However, Patterson was insistent. He had been working in this region for 8 months, and his instincts about local informants had proven reliable before. Finally, his commanding officer agreed to delay the convoy by 2 hours while they sent a reconnaissance team to verify the report. Captain David Morrison led that reconnaissance team, taking a squad of 12 men on a wide circular route that would allow them to observe the ambush site from a safe distance. Morrison had served in North Africa and Italy before being transferred to the European theater, and he had learned to trust local intelligence sources. If this girl was right, they would see signs of German presence. If she was wrong, they would have wasted 2 hours but saved face by checking. 3 kilometers from the ambush site, Morrison's point man signaled a halt. He had spotted tracks in the snow, multiple sets, too organized to be from local civilians. Morrison deployed his men in a defensive perimeter and moved forward with his binoculars. What he saw through those lenses made his blood run cold. The German positions were exactly where Marie had described them. Morrison could make out at least 35 soldiers in their white camouflage, so perfectly positioned that he would have driven past them without noticing if he had not known exactly where to look. The ambush was designed with professional precision, covering every possible escape route, with overlapping fields of fire that would have turned the road into a death trap. Morrison backed away slowly, signaling his men to retreat with absolute silence. Once they were safely distant, he radioed his findings to command. The girl had been right about everything. More than that, she had provided intelligence that was about to save nearly 500 American lives. The decision was made to not only cancel the convoy's route, but to set up a counter-operation. If the Germans were waiting for an ambush that never came, they would eventually realize something had gone wrong. Better to turn their trap back on them, using superior numbers and the element of surprise now that the Americans knew exactly where to find them. Major Robert Collins of the 106th Infantry Division coordinated the response. He had 3 companies available, roughly 360 men, plus artillery support from a battery positioned 8 kilometers away. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. While the Germans waited for a convoy that would never arrive, American forces would encircle their position from 3 sides, cutting off retreat and forcing surrender. Collins understood the irony of the situation. The German forces during the war had built their entire military strategy on speed, surprise, and overwhelming force at the point of contact. Now, thanks to a 17-year-old Belgian girl, they were about to experience those same tactics used against them. The operation began at 1400 hours, 4 hours after the original convoy would have entered the ambush zone. American forces moved through the forest in 3 columns, using the terrain and tree cover to approach undetected. They had been trained in winter warfare during their deployment preparation, and they used every technique. White cloth over their helmets, careful placement of each footstep, hand signals instead of verbal commands. Captain Schneider was beginning to worry. The convoy should have appeared by now. His men had been in position for over 6 hours, and the cold was becoming dangerous despite their winter gear. Some were showing signs of frostbite. He considered sending a scout to check the main road, but movement might compromise their concealment if the Americans were simply running late. He never got the chance to make that decision. The first indication that something was terribly wrong came when Sergeant Hans Muller, positioned on the northern edge of their perimeter, whispered urgently into his radio. He had spotted movement through the trees, multiple figures in American uniforms, far too many to be a normal patrol. Before Schneider could respond, artillery shells began falling on predetermined coordinates, creating a curtain of explosions that cut off the Germans' retreat route to the east. The American infantry moved in immediately after the artillery barrage, calling out in both English and German for the surrounded soldiers to surrender. Collins had made it clear to his officers, these men were trapped with no escape route, outnumbered nearly 8-1, with artillery prepared to continue bombardment if they chose to resist. Give them every opportunity to surrender rather than fight a hopeless battle. Schneider stood in his position, watching American soldiers emerge from the forest in numbers that seemed impossible. How had they known? How had they positioned forces so precisely around his ambush site? He thought about the 3 days of careful preparation, the confidence he had felt just hours ago. Now, surrounded and outgunned, he had only one realistic option. He ordered his men to lay down their arms and raise their hands. One by one, 43 German soldiers emerged from their concealed positions. Hands raised, faces showing a mixture of relief and confusion. Not a single shot had been fired. The ambush that was supposed to eliminate nearly 500 Americans had instead resulted in the bloodless capture of an entire German unit. The interrogations that followed provided even more disturbing information for the German prisoners. When Schneider was asked how the Americans had known about the ambush, he was told the truth. A teenage girl from the local village had observed their preparations and reported every detail to American forces. Schneider sat in silence for several minutes after hearing this, processing the implications. His carefully planned operation, executed with professional precision, had been undone by a civilian, a child, someone who should have been too frightened to act. The psychological impact of this revelation rippled through the captured soldiers. They had been taught that local populations would remain passive, too intimidated by occupation to interfere with military operations. The idea that a 17-year-old girl had not only observed them, but had actively sought out American forces to warn them, challenged their fundamental assumptions about occupied territories. Private Franz Weber, one of the youngest soldiers in Schneider's unit, was particularly affected by this information. He was 19 years old, just 2 years older than Marie. During his interrogation, he kept asking questions about her. Was she punished? Did the Germans know who had informed? Was her family safe? The American interrogator, Lieutenant Patterson, who had been the first to receive Marie's warning, assured Weber that measures had been taken to protect her identity. What Weber did not know was how much danger Marie still faced. Despite American efforts to keep her involvement secret, word had spread through Rochefort that someone had warned the Americans about the ambush. German commanders in the region were furious, launching investigations to identify the informant. They questioned dozens of villagers, searching homes, making threats. The penalty for resistance activities was well established and brutally enforced. Marie's grandmother understood the danger they were in. She had lived through occupation before, and knew how quickly suspicion could become accusation. She insisted that Marie maintain her normal routine exactly as before, showing no change in behavior that might draw attention. Marie went to the well at the same time each day, gathered firewood on the same schedule, avoided eye contact with both German and American soldiers when either passed through the village. The strain of maintaining this facade while knowing that discovery could come at any moment took its toll. Marie had nightmares about being dragged from her home, about watching American soldiers ambushed because she had failed to warn them in time, about her grandmother suffering because of her actions. She was 17 years old, an age when most concerns should involve school and friends, not life and death decisions with consequences for hundreds of people. 3 weeks after the prevented ambush, Lieutenant Patterson returned to Rochefort. He had been authorized to offer Marie and her grandmother evacuation to Allied-controlled territory. The risk of remaining in the village was simply too high. Patterson found Marie at the well, using the same pretext of asking for water to initiate conversation. When he explained the evacuation offer, Marie's first question was about the other villagers. If she and her grandmother suddenly disappeared, would the Germans punish their neighbors in retaliation? Would innocent families suffer because she had made the choice to warn the Americans? Patterson could not guarantee that would not happen. Reprisals against villages after resistance activities were common. Marie listened to his answer, then made her decision. She would stay. Whatever happened, she would not be responsible for bringing harm to her neighbors. Patterson argued with her, explaining the very real danger she faced. Marie was firm. She had made her choice on December 8th when she approached his jeep. She had known the risks then and she accepted them now. Patterson left Rochefort that day with profound respect for this teenage girl's courage and an equally profound sense of helplessness at his inability to protect her. The larger war continued to develop around them. The quiet sector of the Ardennes, which had seemed so safe in early December, erupted into one of the conflict's most significant operations just 8 days after Marie's warning. The German military launched a massive offensive through the region on December 16th, involving hundreds of thousands of soldiers and thousands of vehicles. The attack caught Allied forces by surprise, creating a dangerous bulge in the defensive lines that gave the operation its historical name. The 106th Infantry Division, which would have lost 480 men to Schneider's ambush if not for Marie's intervention, found itself directly in the path of this offensive. Lieutenant Crawford's convoy, the one that had been scheduled to use that forest road on December 8th, was instead properly positioned in defensive fortifications when the assault began. Those 480 men, alive because of one girl's courage, fought with determination during the subsequent weeks of intense combat. Many of them survived because they were not already casualties before the main offensive even began. They fought in defense of Bastogne, held critical road junctions, provided covering fire for retreating units. The ripple effects of Marie's warning extended far beyond the immediate prevention of one ambush. Those soldiers went on to participate in actions that affected the outcome of the entire campaign, creating consequences that would have been impossible to predict on that cold December morning when a teenage girl decided to risk everything. Captain Schneider spent the remainder of the conflict in a prisoner camp in England. He had time to reflect on what had happened, to think about the girl who had observed his preparations and made the decision to act. In his diary, which was preserved after the war, he wrote extensively about that December day. He expressed something unusual for a military officer: respect for an enemy civilian who had demonstrated courage beyond anything he had expected. Schneider wrote about how his training had emphasized the importance of planning, preparation, and execution. He had done everything correctly, according to his instruction. The failure had not been tactical or strategic. It had been the failure to account for human variables, for the possibility that a 17-year-old girl might possess the awareness to recognize danger, the courage to act on that recognition, and the determination to see her warning delivered, despite all risks. Private Weber, the young soldier who had been so concerned about Marie's safety, was repatriated to Germany in 1946. He returned to a country devastated by conflict, where cities lay in ruins and millions struggled to rebuild their lives. He carried with him the memory of being captured without firing a shot, of learning that a teenage girl had been responsible for preventing what would have been his first combat engagement. That memory shaped his perspective on warfare and resistance in ways that influenced the rest of his life. Weber eventually became a teacher in Hamburg, specializing in history. He taught his students about the war, but always emphasized the human elements, the small decisions made by ordinary people that had extraordinary consequences. He never forgot Marie Dubois, though he never knew if she had survived the war. The memory of her courage became a central theme in his teaching. That resistance to injustice does not require military force, that sometimes the most powerful weapons are observation, intelligence, and the willingness to act despite fear. Marie and her grandmother did survive the war. The investigation into who had warned the Americans eventually faded as larger events overtook the region. The massive offensive launched on December 16th created chaos that consumed German attention and resources. By the time Allied forces liberated Rochefort in January 1945, Marie's role in preventing the ambush was known only to a handful of American officers who had carefully protected that information. She was 19 years old when the war ended, having spent her late teenage years living under occupation, making impossible choices, and carrying secrets that could have killed her. When her parents finally returned from England in the summer of 1945, they found their daughter physically unchanged, but fundamentally transformed by her experiences. Marie was quiet about what she had done, deflecting questions and praise with the modest observation that she had simply done what needed to be done. It was not until 1958, 13 years after the war's end, that Marie's story became public. Lieutenant Patterson, now a civilian journalist, wrote an article about unrecognized heroes of the war. He had maintained contact with several of the soldiers whose lives Marie had saved, and he felt their story deserved to be told. He contacted Marie, now married with 3 children, and asked permission to write about that December morning. Marie was reluctant. She had built a quiet life teaching at the local school in Rochefort, raising her family in the same stone farmhouse where she had lived during the occupation. She did not see herself as a hero, just someone who had made a choice in a moment of crisis. But Patterson was insistent. 480 men had gone on to live full lives because of her actions. They had children, grandchildren, careers, contributions to their communities. The ripple effects of her courage extended through generations. When the article was published, Marie received letters from across America. 12 became teachers. 2 started businesses that employed hundreds of people. The economic and social impact rippled outward in ways impossible to fully quantify. Captain Schneider, who had planned the ambush with such careful precision, lived until 1978. In his later years, he corresponded with several of the soldiers he would have ambushed that day. These letters were remarkable documents, showing how former enemies could find common ground in shared humanity. Schneider wrote about how his military training had emphasized tactical excellence, but had failed to prepare him for the psychological realities of warfare. That enemies were human beings, with families and futures. That civilians caught in conflicts faced impossible choices with profound courage. He never met Marie Dubois, though he expressed the wish to do so in his letters. He wanted to tell her that her actions had haunted him in the best possible way, forcing him to reconsider his understanding of courage, duty, and moral responsibility. His capture on December 8, 1944, had been the most humiliating moment of his military career. It had also been, he wrote, the moment that saved his soul, because it had shown him that there were values more important than tactical victory. Marie continued teaching in Rochefort for 32 years, retiring in 1977. Her students knew her as a patient, thoughtful teacher who emphasized critical thinking and moral courage. She never spoke about her wartime experience in class unless specifically asked, preferring to focus on the broader lessons of history rather than her personal role. But when students did ask, usually after learning about her story from their parents, she would tell them about the importance of paying attention, of trusting your instincts when something seems wrong, of finding the courage to act even when acting puts you at risk. She spoke about fear not as weakness, but as information, a signal that something important was happening that required a response. She told them that the bravest thing she had ever done was not approaching that American jeep, but walking back to her grandmother's house afterward, returning to normal life while carrying the secret of what she had done, waiting to see if her warning would be believed and acted upon. The soldiers whose lives Marie saved aged into their 70s and 80s, and they maintained contact with her through letters and occasional visits. They formed an informal association, meeting every 5 years on December 8th to commemorate the day they were supposed to have faced certain harm, but instead continued living because of one girl's courage. These gatherings were bittersweet, celebrating survival while acknowledging the passage of time that gradually diminished their numbers. At the gathering in 1984, 40 years after the event, only 60 those men went on to have families. By 1961, those 480 men had collectively fathered over 700 children. Those children would go on to have their own families, creating thousands of descendants who owed their existence to a decision made in one moment of crisis. Beyond direct descendants, there were the professional and community contributions. Those soldiers became teachers, doctors, engineers, farmers, business people. They built homes, created jobs, served in their communities. One became a state senator. 3 became physicians. 2001, passing away at the age of 74. Her obituary in the New York Times ran over 1,000 words, detailing not just her wartime courage, but her life afterward. The students she had taught, the community she had served, the family she had raised. The piece noted that while she had received formal recognition for her actions, she had always been uncomfortable with the attention, preferring to see herself simply as someone who had been in the right place to help, and had made the choice to do so. Among those who attended her funeral were 12 veterans of the 106th Infantry Division, men now in their 80s, who traveled to Belgium to pay their respects. They stood at graveside in their old uniforms, rendered honors, and shared stories about the woman who had given them their futures. They spoke about how they had lived their entire adult lives with the knowledge that they owed their existence to a teenage girl's courage, and how that knowledge had shaped the choices they made and the values they tried to embody. The final speaker at Marie's funeral was Thomas Crawford, 93 years old, who had been the lieutenant leading the convoy on that December morning. He spoke about meeting Marie for the first time in 1961, how he had expected to find a remarkable person, and instead found someone remarkably normal, someone who insisted that courage was not extraordinary, but simply the choice everyone could make when circumstances demanded it. Crawford read from a letter Marie had written to him in 1998, when both were dealing with health issues that came with advanced age. In that letter, she had written about perspective and meaning. She said that she had lived an ordinary life, teaching children, raising a family, participating in her community. The only extraordinary moment had been one morning in December 1944, when she had seen something wrong and made the choice to act. But that single choice, she wrote, had given her entire life meaning beyond anything she could have planned or predicted. She wrote that she hoped each person would have at least one such moment, one opportunity to make a choice that mattered, to act with courage when courage was required. She hoped they would recognize that moment when it came and have the strength to act, because those moments, rare as they were, defined who we became and what our lives meant. Crawford, 3 of the original 480 men were still alive. Marie, now 67 years old, traveled to America for the first time to attend. She stood before these elderly veterans and saw in their faces the young men they had been, the futures they had been given, the lives they had built. They presented her with a quilt made from patches contributed by the families of every soldier who had been in that convoy, living and deceased, 480 squares representing 480 lives touched by her actions. Marie lived until Veterans of the 106th Infantry Division wrote to thank her, some sending photographs of their families, wanting her to see the direct results of her warning. One letter came from Thomas Crawford, who had been the lieutenant leading the convoy that December morning. He wrote about how he had not known about the ambush until weeks later, how he had learned that he and his men had been scheduled to drive straight into a trap. Crawford described lying in a foxhole during the subsequent offensive, cold and frightened and exhausted, and finding comfort in the knowledge that at least he was alive to experience those feelings. He wrote about the children he had raised, the career he had built, the 43 years of life he had lived since that war ended. He wanted Marie to know that all of it, every moment, existed, because a 17-year-old girl had seen something wrong and refused to remain silent. The formal recognition came in 1961, when the United States government awarded Marie the Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian honor. The ceremony took place in Washington, and 23 veterans of that prevented ambush attended, ranging in age from their late 30s to their 50s. They stood as Marie received the medal, these men who had served in uniform, honoring the teenage girl who had saved their lives while wearing nothing more protective than a worn winter coat. In her acceptance speech, Marie spoke briefly about courage and choice. She said that she had been terrified that December morning, watching German soldiers prepare their trap, knowing that people would face harm if she did nothing. But she had also been terrified of what might happen if she tried to help. Fear, she said, was not the absence of courage. Courage was acting despite fear, making the choice to do what was right, even when every instinct screamed to stay safe and silent. She dedicated the medal to her grandmother, who had passed away in 1956. It had been her grandmother's strength that gave her the confidence to approach that American Jeep. Her grandmother's wisdom that had protected them both in the dangerous weeks that followed. Without that support, Marie said, she might never have found the courage to act. The mathematical reality of Marie's impact was staggering when calculated in full. 480 soldiers directly saved from the ambush. But finished reading and looked out at the assembled mourners, many of them descendants of the soldiers Marie had saved, living proof of her impact. He said that Marie had been wrong about one thing. Her life had not been ordinary, a life that touched so many others that created ripples extending through generations. That proved the power of individual courage in the face of overwhelming fear. Such a life was extraordinary in the deepest sense. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.